I'm not sure. I think somebody, anyway, it's being recorded. Some of
I
these.
might just say, Walter, before you get the slides up, that, on behalf of the Reston Town Center Association, I want to thank you personally for reaching out and offering to do this and to educate people about the important work that the task force is doing. So thank you very much for making all of yourselves available for this, for today.
Well, thank you, Robert. And as we get into the timeline, I think there'll be additional opportunities for folks to engage as they have interest. So thank you for getting this set up. And let's see, Jose, can you put the slides up?
I don't have the presenter role. Lisa does, but I can put up the slides if it's easier.
So Lisa giving you the presenter role?
Yeah, she can give it to me. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I was multitasking with WebEx. So, but Jose has the presenter role now.
Let's see if I still know how to do this. Share my screen.
All right, good. There we go. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, so today we're going to see a presentation of the initial task force recommendations, or I'm sorry, the interim recommendations of the task force. Here you can see a list of all the task force members and alternates, and there are several that are on the call today and will be available to discuss any of the issues or questions or concerns that folks might have about any of the interim task force recommendations. So go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so just a little bit of background, and I know Robert's familiar with this. Just as this task force has worked much of the last 2 years, Robert, I think you put 4 in, is that right, or 5 years into it?
Felt like 55, but it's something like that.
So anyway, but that recommendation, those recommendations were ultimately approved. 2014 was the first part of that those recommendations, and ultimately the comprehensive plan amendment. And 2015 was a second round, basically outside of the transit station areas. So as part of this process, county staff and primarily Reston Association worked on doing some estimates of a hypothetical build out of Reston. So hypothetically, if every landowner in Reston maximized their density, what would the population of Reston look like? So, so ultimately, if you did that calculation and landowners maximize the non-residential development, you get to somewhere about 127,000 people as a population, give or take. I mean, obviously this depends on things like household size and everything, but this would be a theoretical maximum build out. If landowners maximized every residential option in the current comprehensive plan, you get closer to about 157,000. So I think for those of you that aren't highly schooled in the doctrines of comprehensive planning, it does serve as the guide for future development. You know, in Reston, we actually spent the first several decades of Reston's existence not relying on the comprehensive plan. It was actually the Reston Master Plan, which was developed by Robert E. Simon Jr. and implemented. That was the guide for many years. However, as Reston built out, and frankly, the big change, and this is what the task force that Robert was a part of accounted for, was the Silver Line and transit-oriented development around the future metro station. So the comprehensive plan is, as a statewide mechanism, is the guide for future development in any jurisdiction. So, and it's implemented generally through rezoning and other land use applications. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, there are 14 areas of the comprehensive plan that have interim recommendations. They are currently undergoing a deeper dive review by county staff, and there are a series of public engagement meetings, including this one, where feedback is coming from members of the public. And the idea is that the task force will hear all this from county staff, from the community engagement, and then go back and finalize their recommendations. And then I'll go over a timeline later, but basically the task force is looking to wrap up probably in the May timeframe. Then through the summer will be a series of even more intensive public engagement meetings and a process. Then we end up with Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors public hearings in the fall and ultimate adoption by the end of the year. And there is a link on here, and I believe these slides will be sent around, but there's a link to the interim recommendations. And actually, Jose or Lisa can also put those up in the chat if you haven't seen the actual recommendations, all 180 pages, I think, 190, something like that, of the task force. So go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to turn it over now to a couple of task force members who will walk through these interim recommendations at a high level, at least. So John or David, I believe.
David's our leadoff hitter.
Okay, David. All right.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm going to talk about planning principles and heritage resources. Planning principles written principally by Tammy Petrine, and it provides high-level guidance for future development in Reston. We are trying to foster sustainable and innovative projects, and she built this on the following principles. First of all, public involvement in development proposals, excellence in planning and urban design and architecture, making sure that infrastructure was phased with development rather than lagging development, offering a mix of urban and suburban lifestyles throughout Reston, the transformation of the TSA corridor. Reston is going to remain a vibrant business and employment community, employment center, as well as hosting educational activities and research activities. We want to insist that housing to accommodate individuals and families of all ages, abilities, and income levels is in the plan. And connectivity and mobility is key throughout Reston. John's going to talk about that a little bit, more than a little bit in session. Multimodal transportation with vehicles, bikeways, pedestrians, the paths linking all parts of Reston to each other and also to the TSAs. Recreation facilities and open space are key. Health and wellness and equity, inclusion, and community. For heritage resources, Reston has known and potential heritage resources, architectural ones, cultural ones, historic aspects of the community, historical aspects of the community. We need to ensure that all these resources are well documented, and we also need to ensure that robust surveys of potential heritage sites are conducted and fully documented and then placed before the county to formally designate them as heritage resources. And obviously we want to guard against losing any more of these potential sites to other kinds of development. So next slide.
So the transportation chapter was developed by a team of Gary Maupin, Bill Penniman, and myself. And we stress the need to constantly monitor and adjust the mutual impacts of land use on the one hand and transportation on the other, especially in the TSAs, but also by transportation demand management throughout Reston. We wanted to strengthen the multimodal transportation system we have by improving both facilities and services for active mobility modes like walking, biking, and so forth, for transit and for private occupancy vehicles, and also by focusing on placemaking. So placemaking makes getting around clear and pleasurable. And that placemaking makes these modes more attractive, the multimodal modes, and will, we believe, eventually reduce reliance on private occupancy vehicles. And then finally, we want the transportation improvements to attend to the environmental, the community health, and the equity dimensions of the Reston transportation system. On public facilities, this was led by Charles Colby. The public facilities section covers all those facilities maintained either by local government or by nonprofits that meet critical recreational and social service needs. It includes, for example, government offices, schools, fire and rescue, law enforcement, library, health and human services, housing for the homeless, recreation and entertainment, and water and sewer systems. And so the purpose of this chapter was to identify our present inventory of these facilities, to project what the future needs would be, and then recommend that the future development of these facilities be done in consistently with the core values that David enunciated at the beginning. Next slide, please.
Land use, written by Lynn Mulston and several other members of the task force. The purpose of this document is attempting to link Reston's planning principles, which we discussed on the first slide, as a guide for developers to use in their projects. Along with Fairfax County's design guidelines, the land use chapter tries to establish an expectation of excellence in project planning, excellence in design, and excellence in architecture. It focuses, as written, on existing conditions and on a future vision for the various areas of Reston. It actually addresses each of these areas individually. And the language in this chapter is intended to encourage the appropriate mix of uses envisioned in the TSA. For affordable housing, the focus of this chapter was to make sure that we are increasing our efforts to provide more affordable housing throughout Reston. Affordable and workforce dwelling units for those people who earn 60 to 80% of AMI, as well as individuals and families, as well as individuals who earn less than 60% of AMI in assisted housing, or people who even earn less than that who are in serious financial need. An expanded homeless shelter, which is already underway, an emergency facility for extreme weather conditions, dedicated housing for senior residents with lower incomes, development and expansion of the missing middle type of housing. One of the things that I neglected to mention in the last group meeting with Smarter Growth folks is there's a lot of emphasis in this document on preservation of existing, which is in line with Fairfax County's guidelines already. A lot of emphasis on preservation of existing affordable housing, one-for-one replacement, and no net loss. We want the county to expand its coordination and cooperation with other government, nonprofit, and for-profit entities that are key players in providing affordable housing in Reston and the DC metro area. We're looking at adaptive reuse of existing commercial properties for residential living. Looking at use of county-owned land to support development of multifamily affordable rental units. Expansion of public-private partnerships, including something that's called mixed income development projects, where we can potentially provide affordable units, not workforce, but affordable units in larger structures of over 4 stories, and not stick built, by doing a mixed income group. And then finally, creation, we hope, of a community land trust pilot program in Reston. So, excuse me, next slide.
So the Parks chapter was led by Jennifer Juszczyk and Larry Butler. And it begins by stressing the need to preserve our parks, recreation, and open space in the spirit of Bob Simon, who very much wanted Reston to be a harmonious integration of residential, downtown, but always links to nature and preservation of nature as much as possible. It wants the development of new parks and recreation spaces to be done collaboratively through proffer contributions, public support, and private donations. It wants to, especially as we foresee the increases in population, which Walter averted to at the beginning, we need to make sure that we have enough facilities of parks and open space for not only the new residents, but also the new office dwellers who frequently will use those facilities either during the day breaks or in the evening. And finally, we want to make sure that the TSA areas especially, that the redevelopment there has the adequate provision of parks and open spaces, because that is where the major population growth will be, and they need close by facilities. The environmental stewardship chapter was led by Tammy Petrine and Bill Penniman. And it began with a point of pride. Again, Bob Simon's founding vision of Reston being a community whose residential and business areas are well integrated with nature. That was increased recently when Reston became only the 13th community in the world to become a biophilic community, which meets special standards to integrate nature and harmony with nature in the life of its citizens. It not only for people, but also for wildlife, and also taking into consideration ways we're going to need to mitigate the effects of climate change. So it focuses on a number of areas: watersheds, lakes, ponds, stream valleys, wetlands, tree canopies and native flora, green buildings, noise abatement, lighting regulations, which provide the lighting needed for security, but also do not do so in a way that causes excess lighting, which can be harmful to both humans and wildlife. And finally, that the transportation and transit-oriented development that we aim for will lower the environmental impacts of our traveling. Next slide, please.
Public art, written by Tammy Petrine and Bill Penniman. Diverse forms of public art, including performance space, have been and must continue to be integral to Reston's identity and shared values, which includes Reston's commitment to equitably distributing public art throughout the community. There are examples of public art, many examples of public art currently in Reston. All development is expected to contribute in measurable ways to Reston's public art landscape, and the organization Public Art Reston will continue to perform a central role in promoting, coordinating, and maintaining public art projects. Certainly the Public Art Master Plan for Reston should be a guide for developing public art, and developers should coordinate their activities or their proposals with Public Art Reston. For economic development, written largely by Gary Maupin, it is one of a couple of new chapters in new sections in the comprehensive plan, not only for us, but for the rest of Fairfax County. The principle being that Reston is a hub for global and regional business and innovation. And the chapter's policy direction and intent is to, and I'll just read these: grow a sustainable and diversifying workforce, enhance appeal, and build infrastructure to businesses, organizations, and workers, diversify Reston's economy, attract new high-value businesses, and attract new and nurture existing small businesses, ensure the economic vitality of the town center, the TSAs, and the village centers, and promote high quality educational activities. Next slide.
Community, as David mentioned, there are innovations in this new plan, and community health is another one of them. Indeed, this is not only the first time this kind of chapter will appear in a Reston comprehensive plan, but also in any Fairfax County comprehensive plan. It is being done in other significant cities in the U.S. also. And there are really two main definitions of community health. One is that it, as portrayed in this chapter, one is it's a very holistic view of health, and secondly, it's interwoven. Let me explain what those two things mean. It's holistic because it tries to look at what is needed, not just for the physical health of our citizens, our community members, but also mental health and the quality of life for everyone who lives, works, or plays in the community. So it's holistic that way. It is also holistic in the sense that it interweaves public health concerns throughout a number of major functions. So not only the obvious of providing health care and services, but providing healthy and active living, supporting healthy food systems, supporting green neighborhoods and healthy buildings, and encouraging social cohesion, which is so important for people's mental health and happiness. And another interwoven feature in this is equity, which, as you all know, the One Fairfax policy is focusing on county-wide. And that is to make sure, in this case, in the case of health, to make sure that all members of the community share in these health, these efforts to improve health, especially those that are disproportionately born, or those who are disproportionately underserved or underrepresented in the community. So equity also is interwoven through all that. Walter, up to you.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So this is something that's not in the interim recommendations, but continues to be an area of study. And the idea is earned density. Some of you may remember that until about 20 years ago in Fairfax County, there was something called the residential density criteria, which evolved into the residential development criteria. And the idea then, and this is what's being at least considered now, is should there be criteria that developers would earn their way towards the high end of the density range in the comprehensive plan or the maximum density called for in the comprehensive plan. So it's kind of a big open question. And if so, what should those additional criteria be? So there's a subgroup that is working on that. Of the task force, a couple of those subgroup members are actually on the call today. And so those discussions continue, but I'd welcome any thoughts on that, on what might be appropriate, what might not be there. So go ahead, Jose, to the next slide. This is the timeline that I mentioned. This basically just lays out what we had spelled out earlier. So we are in the task force is doing initial public engagement. They should finalize their recommendations based on feedback from these meetings, also feedback from county staff. Those task force recommendations will be finalized in probably May. Then additional community engagement, and ultimately Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors public hearings later on this fall. So I think that's it. Is there another slide? I think it's an exciting slide. That's, yeah, it is, questions. So so with that, let's go ahead and just open it up. People have comments or questions on any of this, and I'll put myself on mute at least for now until someone asks me a question.
I'll just say on behalf of Reston Town Center Association, Walter, and all the task force colleagues, thank you very much. Appreciate the effort being made here today to try to get people up to speed in what you're talking about. Rather than me ask questions, which doesn't seem like a good process, I'm going to hold here and let's see if there are people on the call here, especially Reston Town Center residents or stakeholders, commercial or otherwise, that would like to get in on the conversation and ask a question.
Let me see if I can start it with something. This is Brian Carlson, just a Reston resident. But I guess I wonder, when we think about the layout of Reston and so forth, and the concepts that were behind its founding and so forth, one of the issues was always that it would be a place where people could live and work. I just wonder what the data is. How many people in Reston live within walking distance of their workplace? And then maybe, I don't know if you have this, but how many could get there by public transportation or do currently? I guess that's what I'm really wondering. How many people currently, how many Reston residents walk to work? How many take public transportation to work? And then presumably the balance is pretty much, well, you could have bicycles, but the balance is probably private automobile. But do we have metrics to begin to measure? Are we doing better than we used to do? Or, you know, will we be able to show that we're getting better according to the decisions taken?
I think I would let John Mooney answer that if he was responsible for the transportation section. But I mean, I would say since COVID, there are so many people that are working from home. I don't know what the current metrics are. And I think that whatever metrics were used prior to 2020, as we're coming out of COVID.
I know of no current metrics. I know that in Fairfax County DOT's planning for ultimate build out, which is very, very, very loosely described as 2050, but don't hang anything on that, that they were hoping for for the TSAs, they were hoping for a 45% reduction, a very ambitious goal of 45% reduction, or no, it's 42% reduction through a combination of transportation demand management, more efficient use of roadways because of more efficient signals. One of the factors computed in that was the the hoped for impact of autonomous vehicles making the use of roadways better. So that's all I can say what the hope was, what the planning hope was, that in full build out, we would have a 42% reduction. And when I say reduction, that means a reduction from the projections that are done using the formulae of the Institute of Traffic Engineers. So they have a very fallible, set of types of buildings and how much each of those types of buildings, how many trips each of those will generate. So from that ITE estimate, the goal was by full build out, to have a 42% reduction in trips that would otherwise be expected from the TSAs. That's the best answer I can give.
And Brian, we can maybe with Jose or Lisa's help, we can check and see what the most recent numbers on those mode splits. So thank you for asking. I think that is baseline info.
Pardon me, Walter. When I say 42%, that is the best case, closest to the TSAs. As you get, as you get to the transit stations, as you get farther from the station, that reduction decreases. But it is a very estimative metric. It is not at all. We don't have good data for it now.
Yeah, I understand measuring human behavior is never easy, but it would seem to me that we really ought to begin getting some baselines, so we can tell whether or not things are improving. And I'm sure that those figures on people, how they commute, how they get to work, would be different depending on where they live. But we could begin to define that, and that you would be able to see whether you are making progress or not.
VDOT is doing that. VDOT is doing that in the transit station areas for developments in the transit station areas, because they have transportation demand management agreements with developers, and the developers have to report on how much reduction they're getting. So it's spotty data, but we do have data.
We
I
do.
could add. Go ahead.
Let me try. There are numbers in the plan that would help us to spell this out, and they're fairly accurate. You can be sure today that very few people, we don't have a lot of jobs today in Reston. In the future, we will have a balance of about 2.8 to 3 jobs per household. What is balanced is 1.5. So we're jobs heavy in Reston, which we should be, given it's the Dulles corridor. Now, how many of those people actually can walk to their job? I'm not sure we can get to that, but we can get pretty close. But today we're probably exporting people to the jobs today. And in the future, we will turn that around with the additional office space that we're getting.
If I can add a little bit to this conversation, the question that comes up with is really dependent upon how we build out the interconnectivity of this community, whether by road or by public transportation or bike paths or pedestrian paths, crosswalks at major intersections that encourage people to, take the bus from North Point down to somewhere in North Point or somewhere in South Lakes to a job in Reston, or take the bus to the metro and go into Tyson's or DC to have to go to their job. The idea, of course, is to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicle trips. And if we don't do the right thing and build out the interconnectivity of this community, we're not going to get there.
Thank you all. It helps.
Great. Do anyone have other questions or comments at this point?
Walter, I might jump in to just make a couple of general comments and pick up on Brian's point. It strikes me that much of the slides that were presented, not exclusively, but much of the slides that were presented could have easily been presented as part of the last task force effort. I mean, there are so much of these broad bromides and palliatives that everybody agrees with. It's, the devil's in the details, of course. And I think if the task force hasn't done this yet, at least in broad strokes, demonstrating how particular recommendations here are different from what has previously been recommended, I think would be very constructive for people to see. An example of that is really Brian's point. So Brian, I would answer to you broadly, on the last task force, fundamentally, the goal of the last task force was to maximize this massive public-private investment in rail. And how were we going to do that? It was to incentivize and encourage transit-oriented development, especially in the transit station areas. But to do that, we wanted to hold ourselves and planners and developers accountable for that. So we actually came up with a formula that within the half-mile to quarter-mile radius of the transit station areas, we wanted to get to 4-to-1 jobs to household ratios so that we maximize the opportunity for people to be able to have the chance to walk to work. We knew that commercial was already heavily entitled in the corridor. And so what we needed to get built was residential to balance that out and create that walkable environment. So translating a 4-to-1 jobs to household ratio, which was something that the country's leading TOD experts were giving us as testimony at the task force, we needed to convert that to a square footage ratio. And ultimately, through estimations, which people could take issue with, we were estimating about 300 square feet per office worker, which then translates to about a 1-to-1 square foot ratio. If you figure that most of the development that's coming in the TSAs were going to be condo and high rise, so you're looking at something like 1,200 square feet units. So to get to 4-to-1, it was a 1-to-1 square foot ratio, residential to office. And so I think, and then for emphasis, because Reston is way underweighted residentially, if you look at the COG data, we wanted to grow that ratio as you moved outside the TSAs. So I guess the question to the task force is, has this notion of a 1-to-1 square foot ratio in the quarter to half-mile radius been changed? Has this idea that that ratio would be increased as you move outside the transit station areas to encourage better jobs to household ratios Reston-wide? Has that been changed? And if so, why?
The answer is no. The ratio has, and if you remember in those early days, we were talking about square footage to square footage, which at this point is not really the best notion. It's jobs to housing. And if you want to be balanced, the Washington region as a region, which has to be balanced, of course, as a region, is 1.6. We are at 2.8 to 3 is where we are. And that's where we were before. And so as we move out from these ratios are the same when you're talking about the areas within a half mile of the transit. They are exactly the same as they've always been. 50-50 is the ratio if you're in a quarter mile, and the 75-25 is the ratio if you're within a half a mile. 75 being the housing and 25 being the commercial. Now, as we move out in the neighborhoods, we've kind of held the line for the most part on the ratios of jobs to housing. It's obviously going to be probably mostly housing as you move out beyond the transit station areas. We've also kept the industrial areas that are in the TSAs pretty much the same. There was debate about adding housing to those, and we did not do that. But a 2.8 to 3 is, I think, a pretty good ratio. And if you just think about it, the areas outside of Reston, Drainsville, Franklin Farm, those would be virtually 100% housing. So we're importing workers basically from those areas into Reston, into the Reston transit corridor. corridor. So the ratios stay pretty much the same, Robert, as they've always been. If you're looking at it 30,000 feet above.
But when you say stay the same, John, do you mean where we are statically now, or are you talking about
No.
projecting 40 years out? which is what we're 25 years ago?
To build out, projected to build out.
So we're trying to grow ultimately that ratio and get it a little more better weighted on the residential side. I mean, one of the big emphases we talked about was growing the residential number. I know there's a general perception, which may be inaccurate, that this group has looked to scale back some of the possibilities on residential development that was contemplated by the last task force. Is that true, or are there?
Well, that's not true. We actually scaled up in a couple areas, although we're having still arguments with staff about that issue, whether we should be adding more density in some of the areas. But these aren't the areas that are within a half-mile transit. So I'd say those ratios
Robert,
are pretty much the same.
Yeah, Robert, I'll just jump in. I mean, the few areas that we're talking about for possible reduction in residential, we're looking at 3 of the older village centers, St. John's Woods, and then a couple of other smaller developments. Charter Oak, yeah.
But those are on the margin. The difference is small. But I think we're about right. That the 2.8 to 3. So there will be more than enough jobs for each household. And if you start going too high on the residential, now you have other public facilities issues. This balance is sort of a magic number and somewhat esoteric. But you don't want to be too heavy on the commercial, because now you got to build roads for people to get there. You don't want to be too heavy on housing, because now you have schools and other public facilities to get there. So I've always thought that you ought to be pretty balanced, but we need to recognize where Reston is in the region. We're on the Dulles corridor, and we're bringing in transit big time. So we probably ought to be a little heavy on the job side. These are my perspectives. Yeah, I think we're about right, and we're about the same as we were before in the last comp plan. I appreciate your comments, though, Robert, because from a global perspective, I think it's very important to keep your eye on that prize, so to speak.
So other comments or questions, preferably from someone RTCA, but if anybody on the task force wants to throw something out, that's okay too.
I'll maybe throw one more out, Walter, to keep it going. I think a lot of us in the community understood that there was concern with what we'll call phase 2 of the last task force effort. You know, the task force itself, which was 40 people and pretty evenly divided, dealt with fundamentally the TSAs and the planning principles, which I thought were really good. And it seems like this group thought they were really good too. They've incorporated a lot of that prior language, I think augmenting it importantly with some equity stuff. And I applaud people for thinking about that. We definitely didn't talk about that. And that's so important and needed. So thank you for thinking about that. But I think there was a feeling that phase 2, which dealt with areas outside the TSAs, and the county had largely done that, and there were concerns from some residents that there wasn't enough residential input. Okay, that this effort was going to focus largely on these areas outside the TSAs. But I'm hearing some of this conversation, we talk about earned density, we talk about ball fields in the TSAs, which is, you know, not something we talked about certainly in town center. There seem to be other things that are impacting within the TSAs. And maybe understanding how, especially in Reston Town Center's case, what you're talking about would change and impact what is already a very robust redevelopment underway based on the prior rules. I think understanding that might be helpful. I'll use the ball field thing as an example. You know, we talked about that, of course, a lot on the prior task force. But we know that in town center, there is a recreational center and a very important community green plan for Reston Town Center North. And we know that there is a massive urban park, urban dynamic space proposed for RTC Next, which will be an extension of the urban core in downtown and will dwarf anything we have in the current urban core now with the pavilion and Mercury Fountain. So there's no space on the ground to put the ball fields unless you're compromising some of these other resources. We, of course, talked about rooftop space, but that's really challenging. It's aspirational. So are people actually talking about putting ball fields in the town center district, and where are those going?
Robert, there's 3 ball fields in the town center district so far. One is from Boston Properties, which will be located at the intersection. It's not actually, it's a developer in the town center district. It's a field that's not in the town center district. So Boston Properties is going to do one at the intersection of Hunter Mill Road and the Toll Road, which I think is pretty good. There is one, Isaac Newton Square has a ball field that's going to be right along the WNOD trail. And then the third one is in Town Center North next to the Recreation Center. So I don't know that there'll be others unless, I don't know. I don't know. So.
Well, thank you, John. That's encouraging to hear. I mean, that's very consistent with what we talked about a number of years back.
It is. I think the Isaac Newton Square is a really good example.
We all thought we thought that was a great spot for a possibility there.
Well, it bounced around to different locations and it finally ended up where it starts. So that's kind of what happens. And the one in Town Center North, right next to the Recreation Center, is a very good site and a long way from transit, really. And I actually like the one on Hunter Mill Road too. I think that's a good site. Whether we'll get any more, I don't know. But there are other aspirations of other smaller kinds of fields, volleyball, things like that, that are possible and are actually being built as part of some of the town center development. EYA development, I believe, has a volleyball field. I think I'm not sure about Boston Properties, they might, but one of the things that we're doing, and this was in the last plan, is all the way along the WNOD trail, particularly in the town center areas. We're expanding the trail so that the open space comes out to Sunset Hills Road. And so now you have a long strip that could be as long as 4 miles long. That would be possible locations for fields. Not soccer fields, not baseball fields, but smaller facilities.
Yeah.
Hey, John, it's Mark Looney. Let me pop in with 2 quick clarifications. One, the site at Hunter Mill Road, which is roughly 7 acres in size, that was acquired and dedicated by Brookfield, which is developing the Halley Rise development as opposed to Boston Properties.
Yeah, that's right.
Boston Properties is proffered or has proffered to either dedicate land at their Reston Gateway Next site for a performing arts center if the county determines that it wants that land for that purpose, or if the county declines to take that land, then it has an obligation to fund construction of a ball field. And I think the anticipation is that that Boston Properties would pay to construct the ball field at Hunter Mill Road, because Brookfield's commitment was to acquire and dedicate the land. The actual construction funding was to be handled either by the Park Authority or by other proffers. And so that's sort of the waterfall, if you will, of how that particular field could get constructed. The other thing I'll note is that there are a number of applications. You mentioned one, Boston Properties, Brookfield, and some others that have some on-site outdoor recreation facilities planned as part of their development as well. Volleyball fields, horseshoe pits, that sort of thing.
Could I ask, when we talk about ball fields and parks and so forth, and they're contributed by the developer or whatever, who then maintains them? Because grass has to be cut, leaves have to be swept, et cetera, ball fields have, particularly if it's a sports field, it has to be maintained for the sporting purpose. Who funds that in
Brian,
perpetuity?
Brian, I'll jump in on that one. Um, it varies, is the short answer. In Reston, the 3 ball fields that John mentioned, all 3 of those would be owned by the Park Authority or the Board of Supervisors. So those would be publicly owned and maintained. In contrast to that, if you look at the fields that are coming into Tyson's, and I know we're not following Tyson's, but still I have to mention this. Those fields are almost all exclusively privately owned and maintained. So they're basically ball fields according to a proffer, indefinite proffer. And there are pros and cons with both. Frankly, I didn't anticipate what ended up was happening in Tyson's, but yeah, so it really does vary case by case. But it's a very good question, Brian. These do have ongoing costs and responsibilities, whoever owns them.
Yeah, because it's obviously either the Reston residents, or it's Fairfax County, or maybe it's the Virginia State, Parks Authority, whatever, and probably not the National Parks Authority.
It depends, Brian, on where it is too. I heard earlier you might be in Gary's building, so you're in town center. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah, so
indeed.
you're in a great position, because if we think about some of the open space in town center, the most prominent example being Reston Town Square Park, that is actually an asset that's owned by the association, and 85% of the association's assessments are paid by the commercial properties, 15% by residents. So you're getting a hell of a deal there, really. That it's amazing space that is, I think, very well maintained. It's incredibly well programmed, mostly by the association. That's an asset that is being paid by the association, but 85% by commercial property revenue.
And in contrast to that, in the older sections of Reston, those were mostly fields and parks that are open space that was donated by the developer. And so the citizens of Reston, through the Reston Association, pays for the upkeep of those, because there are no commercial developers as part of Reston Association. So it would be lovely to see more examples like RTCA, who are able to provide parks and open space and fields, and have the ability to maintain them versus donating them to elsewhere in Fairfax County for either the residents or our county facilities to take care of.
Well, we're coming up close to the top of the hour. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? Okay, then, Robert, I think we're going to be heading over pretty soon to a different meeting.
Yeah, that's right.
Robert, do you want to make any closing statements?
Well, again, to thank you, especially personally, Supervisor Alcorn, for extending this offer to do this call. It's been very helpful. It's an ongoing conversation. I know, for the stakeholders that are on the call, this is, I think, just the second or third community meeting, and there are others that are being planned that Supervisor Alcorn's office, I'm sure, will publicize. They're making a big effort to try to get community input on this. So I'd encourage people to stay engaged and provide that input, and really appreciate all your work here in setting this up today. Thank you.
Robert, thank you, and thanks to everybody on the call, the task force members, the residents, business members of the business community. Robert, thank you very much, and also remember, this is the interim report. We also will have in the summertime a more extensive public engagement period where the task force will be done with their final report, and then we'll be heading into the fall into public hearings. So hopefully we'll see you again then in the summer too, if not sooner, like in a half hour. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
Everyone.